Well, thank you very much, Melandus. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm basically going to pick up on the other half of Martin's brilliant presentation and discussion just now when he focused on the political and government side of democratic capitalism and discuss the business elements of democratic capitalism. Because business is one of the most important institutions in our lives. It clothes, feeds, and houses us, it employs us, and it invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity, the growth of nations, and the reduction of poverty around the world. At the same time, it's been a source of growing environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. It's both saved the world and destroyed the world. And it will go on doing that because in the process, it has been the source of something else. Crises. Crises in capitalism. This century alone, we've had the dot-com crash, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, the pandemic, energy and food crises, and an emerging artificial intelligence crisis, which is probably a more immediate threat to the world than the climate crisis. Crises have been growing in frequency and intensity, and they will continue to do so until we fix the problem. And by that, I do not, of course, mean that business is the only source of the problem. I mean fixing the problem of business producing problems as well as solutions. Why did we invent the corporation? We invented it to solve a problem in ancient Rome of Romans not trusting their bureaucracies. Sounds familiar? So they looked to other ways of solving the problems of collecting taxes, minting coins, and maintaining public buildings. The corporation is a remarkable invention to mobilize resources to solve problems that we as individuals are unable to solve on our own. It galvanizes people, finance, materials around a purpose of solving problems. Problems that you and I have as individuals, communities, societies, and the natural world. And it does that brilliantly, to an extent that we could not have dreamt of less than 200 years ago. But it's also created problems at a scale that we could not have conceived of less than 50 years ago. Why? The reason is one thing: profit. Profit is the source of capital and the reward to capital. It's the most powerful engine that we've ever created. Yet we hardly ever discuss it, analyze it, or consider whether it's an engine that is actually fit for purpose. The reason for that is it's a rather banal and boring concept. It's just the difference between revenue and cost, and you cannot imagine a more boring after-dinner conversation than that. But I argue in my forthcoming book, Capitalism and Crises, How to Fix Them, that is fundamentally wrong. It's one of the most important and interesting conversations we should be having around the liveliest dinner tables because we've got it fundamentally wrong. And because we've got profit wrong, everything is going wrong. Let me explain why. Go back to what I said about the invention of the corporation to solve problems that you and I face as individuals, societies, and the natural world. But I should have added one word to that definition of the purpose of a corporation, namely profitably. It's there to solve problems profitably. It's not philanthropy or charity, and if it doesn't make profits, it does not have the resources it needs to solve problems. It's a sine qua non of capitalism. Without profits, there is no capital. But there's a second part to what we want business to do, and that is to not profit from producing problems. In other words, we want it to produce solutions, not problems, and profit from producing solutions, not problems. That definition of the purpose of a business has a very important corollary to it, and that is what a profit is and what a profit isn't. A profit comes from producing solutions, not problems for us as individuals, societies, and the natural world. How do I know? Well, go back to the originators of the corporation, the Romans, and the origins of the word profit, which are the Latin proficere and profectus, to advance and progress. To profit is to advance and progress, or, as was said in the first session, to achieve. Advancement, progress, achievement come from solving, not creating problems. So what? What's the big deal? The big deal is that that is not what a profit currently is. Yes, profit, of course, comes from solving problems, but it also comes from creating problems. The problems I've described at the start: the environment, biodiversity loss, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. It's also the source of some of the most outrageous and egregious scandals, such as the mis-selling of financial products around the financial crisis, the VW emissions scandal, and the Purdue Pharmacy opioid tragedy. We reward ingenuity, endeavor, and effort, but we also reward polluting, cheating, and exploitation. Economists like to give this phenomenon the cute term negative externalities, that which is not priced or penalized, as if it were an inconvenient aberration of an otherwise perfect depiction of the truth. It's not an aberration, it's endemic, and we do ourselves no favors by pretending that a combination of competition, the law, regulation, and the long term can solve that problem. They don't, and they won't. And a failure to recognize this, placing an intolerable burden on our governments and democratic systems, dividing our societies and undermining our economies. The reason is the way in which the modern corporation was established in the middle of the 19th century. Until then, corporations were established under charter, license, and statute by monarch and parliament. With freedom of incorporation, those restrictions were removed, and a corporation could be established by simply registering itself to pursue any purpose that did not violate law or regulation. As currently defined, the purpose of a corporation pretty much universally is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its shareholders. Shareholders and directors therefore define the purpose of a business, the criteria of its success, and whether it's been successful. It's as if school children set their own exams, mark them, and congratulate themselves on their outstanding performance in their exams. The justification for conferring this discretion on companies was the growing faith placed in competition and the market to align the private interests of firms with social well-being. But if companies can profit at the expense of others, then far from aligning the private and public interests, competition promotes the opposite, runs to the bottom, in which those who wish to uphold principles and values of good conduct are undermined by those who do not. What has made this a particularly acute problem over the last few decades is firstly the growing impact of firms on the environment and societies, and secondly, the increasing pressure from capital as well as product markets on firms to maximize profits at any cost. And regulation won't solve the problem on its own. It's just another challenge for companies to circumvent and preferably turn to their commercial advantage. Take one of the most extensively regulated industries in Britain, the water industry, and its entire failure to protect consumers or communities from its egregious conduct in polluting rivers and coasts and paying itself handsomely for doing that. And where it is successful, regulation drives business elsewhere. Take financial regulation in Britain, some of the finest and most extensive in the world, that has made it one of the safest financial markets in the world. So safe that it doesn't do anything, at least in performing its most important function of financing the growth of small and medium-sized businesses. No, the problem will not be solved if it's not addressed at its roots, namely aligning the private interests of firms with the public interest of solving our problems as individuals, societies, and the natural world. And that requires that they stop profiting at our expense. For the most part, I'm not a great fan of moral laws because they've been a source of oppression as well as enlightenment. But there's one that I advocate in my book, Capitalism and Crisis, and term the moral law. And that is that one should not profit to the detriment of others. It's what I believe is required to establish the original conception of profit as being about advancement and progress. It should be the basis of corporate law and the fiduciary duty of directors to adopt purposes which produce profitable solutions, not problems. Directors and their owners should be held to account for this and be personally liable for a failure to uphold it. Limited liability is the most financially valuable privilege that society confers on a corporation and those who run and own it. It should be withdrawn from companies which abuse that privilege by violating their social responsibilities and inflicting harm on their customers, employees, communities, suppliers, societies, or environments. Directors and owners should be financially liable for unjust enrichment from profit earned as a result. This is the single most powerful tool for aligning the interests of companies, directors, and their owners with those of society and the world around them. But how does a firm determine when it's solving and when it's creating problems? Surely one person's problem can be another's solution. The so-called sin stocks of alcohol, gambling, and tobacco may be the source of enjoyment and pleasure of many people's lives. Fossil fuels might have been deemed to be stranded assets, and as it's termed, until the energy crisis turned them into necessities. A heinous product, such as cluster bombs, might become essential in such circumstances as the war in Ukraine. That is precisely the point. Many, if not most products, are a mixture of good and bad to varying degrees, depending on whom they affect, when and where. That is why the notion of businesses existing to solve problems rather than just produce products is so important. At present, the only criterion by which companies make value judgments about these conflicting effects is financial value, profit, and they leave it to democratically elected governments and legislators to decide about the rest. But governments and the judiciary cannot possibly do this. They cannot know the effect of each product on every purchaser and place, and they cannot fully ascertain all the potential consequences of technological advances. They correctly regard these as business, not political or legal judgments. Companies can and should determine, understand, and respond to the effects that their products and processes have on their customers, employees, communities, and environment. Firms should establish whether they are causing and solving problems. They do this by delegating authority down their organizations to those who regularly interact with their customers and suppliers. That is what local companies used to do, and the most successful firms do today. It's a matter of governance. The principle of subsidiarity should apply as much to business as it does to government, because the boards of companies cannot understand
the problems of their communities and localities any better than central government can. Accountability of boards should then remain solely to their shareholders, because if companies cannot profit from producing problems, then profits are a sufficient measure of the solutions and human flourishing. But they're not at present. We do not refer to the profits of a nation as a measure of its prosperity, advancement, or progress. In fact, we do not refer to aggregate profits as a measure of anything meaningful, only the extent to which some members of a society have prospered at the expense as well as to the benefit of others. For profits to be meaningful, companies must take responsibility for those on whom they impact and depend. But this has been undermined by the growing primacy of shareholders, prompting centralization of authority at the top as boards increasingly look up to their financial masters, their shareholders, not down to those on whom they impact. This is the reason why capitalism is imposing an increasingly intolerable burden on our democratic system and judiciary to address problems they cannot possibly resolve. So there is an important role for public policy as well as the law to play in determining social norms. Take taxation, for example. We have one of the most powerful policy tools at our disposal, corporation tax, which is the only potentially non-distortionary tax if designed appropriately. In fact, we've made it into one of the most distortionary taxes, encouraging companies to fund themselves in exactly the way we don't want them to, namely through debt that raises risks of bankruptcy rather than equity, which does not, and shifting their operations and profits to the lowest tax jurisdictions. We know that we can essentially solve these problems through what is known as a cash flow destination tax, which taxes where the consumption rather than production of products takes place. These corporate taxes extinguish financial distortions, incentivize investment, and avoid profit shifting to the lowest tax jurisdictions. But there's an even more powerful use to which this non-distortionary tax can be put: solving our social and environmental problems. In their desperation to raise revenues, governments are turning increasingly to windfall taxes on corporate profits. Only they shouldn't be regarded as windfalls from temporary surges in profits at all, but instead as excess profit taxes that align private and public interests. The justification for an excess profit tax is that it's based on an unjust excess profit earned at the expense of others. It derives from a failure of a company to account for its true costs of avoiding, mitigating, and remedying the detriments it causes others. To use the externality terminology, it's a powerful instrument, not just of raising revenue, but also of internalizing negative externalities. In fact, we can go even further in converting it into a subsidy to internalize the positive externalities as well. What this does is to recognize that there is a moral as well as a pragmatic justification for excess profit taxes that derives from the immoral nature of excess profits that do not reflect their true costs. Indeed, when directors sign off their accounts as being true and fair, they are often doing no such thing. Their profits are neither true nor fair. They are not true in reflecting the true cost of the firm in avoiding or mitigating detriments, and they are certainly not fair in relation to the distributional consequences they have on those on whom they impact. They are cause of essentially the unjust enrichment. As I hope I may have conveyed, a reconsideration of the nature of profit has a profound effect on the functioning of our economies, societies, and the world we inhabit. But its effect is more significant than just dispensing with business's detrimental effects. It aligns the interests and objectives of business and government around creating benefits. If business cannot profit from producing problems, it must produce solutions through initiative, innovation, and investment. It must find ways of making solutions profitable. Instead, therefore, of the existing conflict between the interests of business in making money and governments in promoting human flourishing, there is cooperation. There is a natural partnership between the private and public sector around a common purpose of creating shared prosperity. The partnership that was discussed in the first section between business, universities, and governments becomes a natural feature of the next stage of a country like Lithuania in its process of development. Competitive markets and regulation remain vitally important, and indeed even more important than at present for two very good reasons. First, competition encourages runs to the top instead of the bottom in promoting, not diminishing human well-being, because good companies are no longer undermined by bad companies. And second, regulation is converted from just a negative crime and punishment restraint on detriments into a positive opportunity to profit from promoting a social license to operate. What has done this is making problem-solving, not creation, the source of profits, and therefore intrinsic to the success of business. But it's not just society, environment, business, and investors that stand to gain from this. So too do economies. The economic performance of Britain since the financial crisis has been abysmal. Productivity has stagnated, and regional inequalities across the country have become more acute than in any developed economy in the world. This followed the collapse of manufacturing industry in the heartlands of Britain in the 20th century. The reason is that the country that originated the idea of competitive markets came to embrace them more fervently than any other in its financial as well as product markets. A combination of privatization, hostile takeover markets, hedge fund activism, dispersed shareholdings, and minority investor protection have made Britain a model of shareholder capitalism, and British companies more exposed to the pressures of the stock market than any others, including in the US. The result has been devastating for capital investment and the funding of the private sector. The UK is not just at the bottom of the league of fixed capital formation of any OECD country, but markedly so. And its financial sector is notoriously poor at funding small and medium-sized company growth, particularly in the depressed regions of Britain. Furthermore, the preoccupation with profits has created a serious conflict with the public sector and undermined public-private partnerships, private finance initiatives in provision of public services, and the privatization of public utilities. Let this be a lesson to the rest of the world, particularly the Baltic countries, that the traditional textbook model of capitalism simply does not work. It undermines the most important asset that individuals, corporations, governments, and nations can have: to be trusted, to be trustworthy, worthy of the trust of others. That trustworthiness comes not just from committing to solving other people's problems, but the profiting of doing that. And the destruction of trust comes not just from causing problems for others, but the revelation that people have profited from doing that. So let me return to the exam question I was set at the beginning. Will corporations destroy or save the world? Let me, like the most unscrupulous pupil, redefine the question ever so slightly to what is required to ensure that corporations will in future help to solve, not destroy, the world? My answer to that is, make the smallest, least distortionary intervention needed to ensure that companies' interests are aligned with the system and world in which they operated. We have placed faith in the suggestion that competitive markets do this automatically, when in fact the originator of this idea, Adam Smith, informed us in no uncertain terms that there are moral preconditions required for this to happen. However, his theory of moral sentiments was too complicated in relation to his simple statement about the source of the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker in his wealth of nations for it to have had a lasting effect. We've forgotten the moral foundations that Adam Smith told us were required to make markets work. My resolution of this is to reduce his moral prescriptions to one short proposition, that corporations should not profit to the detriment of others. That is the single least distortionary, most significant intervention we can make to ensure that corporations are the savior, not the destroyer of the world. And I would suggest it's not a bad proposition to apply in our own personal as well as corporate lives. The Enlightenment saved us from the dogma of religion and superstition, but it entwined us in concepts of reductionism, utilitarianism, and shareholder primacy capitalism. It does not take a prophet to reveal what a profit is not, but a pragmatist to remind us that it is not progress unless we promote human and natural world flourishing and well-being by solving problems without profiting from harming others. Thank you very much.